By May 1945, Berlin was no longer a capital city. It was a graveyard of broken stone-burned streets and endless silence. Nearly 80% of central Berlin had been destroyed, while entire neighborhoods vanished beneath mountains of rubble. There was no electricity, no running water, and no working government. Millions of artillery shells had torn through the city during the final days of World War II, while terrified civilians hid underground, listening to the sound of their world collapsing above them. And then the guns stopped. What remained was something survivors would later call a Geisterstadt, ghost city. Tonight we journey into the final days of Nazi Germany and the horrifying aftermath that followed the Battle of Berlin, from the last desperate defense of the Third Reich to the civilians emerging from bunkers into a city of ashes, to the women who rebuilt Berlin brick by brick while the Cold War quietly began around them. This is not just the story of a military defeat. It is the story of what happens when an empire collapses completely and ordinary people are left standing in the ruins. Welcome to History Legend. Tonight we walk through Berlin 1945. In the spring of 1945, Berlin no longer resembled the proud capital that Adolf Hitler had once promised would rule a 1,000-year empire. The city had become a wounded skeleton of stone, smoke, and fire. For years, Allied bombers had crossed the skies over Germany, turning factories, rail yards, and neighborhoods into fields of shattered concrete. By April, entire districts of Berlin lay flattened beneath mountains of rubble, while windows no longer existed and streets disappeared beneath broken bricks and twisted steel. Fires burned day and night, feeding on the remains of homes, churches, schools, and government buildings. But the worst was still coming. Far to the east, the Soviet army was advancing with terrifying speed after years of brutal war. Across the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers pushed toward Berlin with vengeance carved deep into their memory. Entire Soviet cities had been destroyed during the German invasion of 1941, and millions had died. Now the Red Army stood at the gates of the German capital itself. On April 16, 1945, the final assault on Berlin began. The earth shook beneath one of the largest artillery bombardments in human history. Nearly 2 million shells would be fired into the city during the battle. Soviet guns thundered without pause, turning neighborhoods into collapsing graves, while the sky glowed red through clouds of smoke and dust. Inside subway tunnels and damp basements, mothers held children against their chests while elderly men sat silently beside candles. Some prayed while others simply waited. Every hour the sound of war came closer. The streets above became battlefields of desperation. German soldiers, many of them exhausted teenagers or elderly reservists, defended intersections with rifles, machine guns, and Panzerfausts. Fifth barricades rose between shattered buildings, while snipers hid inside broken apartments overlooking empty avenues. Soviet tanks rolled through streets filled with rubble as infantry fought room by room and staircase by staircase. The battle was no longer about victory, it was about survival. Near the center of the city stood the Reichstag, blackened by fire and shelling around it. Soviet and German forces fought with savage intensity, while explosions echoed through government buildings that had once symbolized the power of the Nazi state. Marble halls became killing grounds filled with smoke and broken glass. Above Berlin, the air itself seemed poisoned by destruction. Electricity had failed across much of the city, while water pipes were shattered and sewage systems no longer functioned. Food supplies disappeared almost entirely, while smoke drifted through the ruins, carrying the smell of ash, fuel, and death. Beneath it all, hidden deep underground, Adolf Hitler remained inside the Führerbunker. The dictator who had plunged Europe into catastrophe spent his final days surrounded by maps of a collapsing empire, while reports arriving inside the bunker grew worse with each passing hour. Soviet forces tightened their grip around the city, while German counterattacks failed almost immediately. Communication lines broke apart, and entire units vanished. Still, Hitler refused to accept reality. Even as Berlin burned above him, he continued issuing impossible military orders to armies that no longer existed. By late April, Soviet soldiers were only blocks away. The Sound of artillery could now be heard clearly inside the bunker walls. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. His death marked the true collapse of the Third Reich, but outside the battle continued. Berlin as civilians wandered through ruins, searching for water bread or missing family members, while horses killed by shellfire were stripped for meat within minutes. Fires consumed entire apartment blocks while the wounded lay trapped beneath collapsed buildings, calling out for help that often never came. The city itself seemed to be dying then. Suddenly, after weeks of unbearable violence, the noise began to fade on. May 2nd, 1945, Berlin officially surrendered to Soviet forces. Guns fell silent, and for the first time in weeks the people hiding beneath the city stepped outside. What they saw hardly looked like a capital anymore. The once great heart of Nazi Germany had become a landscape of ruin, stretching to the horizon. Entire streets no longer existed, while landmarks stood hollowed and burned, and smoke drifted through empty avenues where almost no vehicles moved. Many survivors would later describe the city with a single word: Gestörtstadt, ghost town. The war in Berlin was over, but the silence that followed would haunt Europe for generations. When the battle finally ended, Berlin did not celebrate. There were no crowds in the streets, no music, and no victory parades, only silence after weeks of artillery fire, explosions, and constant gunfire. The sudden stillness felt unnatural, as though the city itself had stopped breathing. From beneath the ruins, people slowly emerged. Cellar doors creaked open, while families climbed out of underground shelters, carrying blankets, buckets, and the few belongings they still possessed. Some stepped into daylight for the first time in weeks, while others had spent months hiding from bombs beneath shattered apartment blocks and flooded subway tunnels. What waited above them barely looked human anymore. Berlin had become a wasteland of ash and broken stone. Entire districts were gone, while streets disappeared beneath mountains of rubble, so deep that people had to climb over collapsed walls just to move through the city. Burned tramcars rested where explosions had thrown them from the tracks, while skeletons of buildings leaned dangerously over empty roads with windows hollow and black like dead eyes. In central Berlin, nearly 80% of buildings had been damaged or destroyed. Reichstag stood shattered, while Potsdamer Platz was reduced to debris, and trees inside the Tiergarten had been stripped bare or cut down entirely for firewood. Smoke still rose from ruins days after the surrender, and everywhere there was dust. Fine gray dust covered streets, clothes, faces, and food, while it drifted through the air with every gust of wind, mixing with the smell of smoke, sewage, and decay. The city no longer functioned. Electricity was gone across large areas of Berlin, while water pipes had burst beneath the bombardment, leaving survivors desperate for clean water. Sewage systems overflowed into the streets, while hospitals operated without medicine or proper equipment, often treating wounded civilians by candlelight. Food had almost completely disappeared. People wandered through ruins searching for anything edible, while potatoes buried beneath collapsed kitchens became treasures. Some survivors traded jewelry for pieces of bread, while others searched abandoned military supplies or stripped vegetables from destroyed gardens. Starvation spread quickly. Children with hollow faces stood beside long food lines, carrying empty pots and buckets, while elderly civilians collapsed from exhaustion. Scavenging through rubble, mothers fought to keep families alive with whatever they could find. The war had ended, but survival had only begun. Throughout the city, thousands of bodies still remained beneath collapsed buildings, while some streets could not be cleared because corpses were buried underneath the rubble. The smell of death lingered in the warm spring air, while overworked civilians and Soviet soldiers gathered bodies into temporary graves wherever space could be found. Almost every survivor had lost someone: a husband, a child, a parent, or a brother. And yet, in the middle of unimaginable destruction, life continued. Women gathered water from broken pumps, while children searched for wood among the ruins. Makeshift markets appeared beside collapsed buildings, where people traded cigarettes, canned food, and scraps of clothing. Doctors treated Patients inside bombed schools and churches, while small fires flickered at night inside broken apartments where families tried to create warmth among the wreckage, but fear still remained. Soviet occupation had brought both liberation and terror. While many civilians feared revenge from victorious soldiers after years of Nazi atrocities committed across the Soviet Union, stories spread rapidly through Berlin of looting, violence, and assault, while some families hid daughters in basements or disguised them in oversized clothing to avoid attention. Trust had disappeared alongside the government. The Third Reich was gone while Hitler was dead, and Nazi banners vanished from public buildings almost overnight. In their place came Soviet flags hanging above ruined streets, guarded by exhausted Red Army troops. Berlin had entered a new world without understanding what that world would become. At night, the city felt almost unreal. Without electricity, darkness consumed entire districts, while fires glowed faintly in the distance and silence settled over the ruins. Survivors slept inside shattered apartments beside broken walls open to the cold air, while somewhere in the darkness, people searched endlessly for missing loved ones who would never return. Many Berliners later said the silence after the battle was worse than the fighting itself, because silence gave them time to understand what had happened. The empire that promised domination over Europe had collapsed into rubble. The capital of Nazi Germany had become a ghost city filled with widows, orphans, and ruins stretching farther than the eye could see, and buried beneath those ruins were the final remains of the Third Reich. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over, but Berlin still looked like the end of the world. Silence that followed the battle had not repaired the city, while rubble remained piled across nearly every major street, and burned buildings stood hollow against the skyline like broken monuments to a dead empire railway. Lines were twisted beyond repair, while bridges had collapsed into rivers, and beneath the ruins, thousands of bodies were still waiting to be recovered. Experts estimated that millions of tons of debris covered Berlin, and some believed it could take more than a decade just to clear the wreckage. And yet slowly the city began to move again, with so many German men dead, imprisoned, or missing after the war. Much of the burden of rebuilding fell upon women. They became known as the Trümmerfrauen, rubble women across Berlin. Women carrying shovels, buckets, and bare hands climbed over mountains of debris from dawn until evening. Some were widows, while others were mothers searching simply for food or survival. Many had lost husbands on the Eastern Front or sons during the final defense of the city. Now they worked among ruins that had once been their neighborhoods. Lines of women formed human chains through shattered streets, passing bricks from hand to hand beneath damaged buildings that could collapse at any moment. Useful bricks were cleaned carefully and stacked for future construction, while twisted metal was dragged away piece by piece. Dust-coated faces and clothing until everyone looked gray beneath the ash of the destroyed city. There were no machines for most of the work, only exhausted people trying to rebuild a civilization by hand. In some districts, survivors lived directly beside the ruins they were clearing, while families slept inside roofless apartments, and children played near bomb craters filled with rainwater. Makeshift gardens appeared among collapsed courtyards where civilians tried desperately to grow vegetables. Berlin was scarred physically, but also emotionally. Every street carried memories of the battle. Near the Reichstag, Soviet flags still flew above shattered government buildings, while bullet holes covered ancient stone walls, and burned military vehicles remained abandoned where they had been destroyed during the fighting. In parks and open spaces, temporary cemeteries stretched across the ground, marked with wooden crosses and handwritten names. The city itself had become a monument to loss. Then came the occupation. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, Berlin was divided among the victorious Allied powers. The Soviet Union controlled the eastern section of the city, while the United States took control of the southwest. Great Britain occupied the western districts, and France controlled the northwest sector. At first the arrangement appeared temporary, but beneath the surface tensions were already growing. Wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies had been built against a common enemy. Now that Nazi Germany no longer existed, distrust returned quickly. Soviet Authorities promoted communist influence in the East, while American and British sectors began rebuilding under democratic systems supported by Western aid. Berlin became more than a ruined city. It became the center of a new political struggle that would shape the modern world. The Koke, more than a ruined city, it became the center of a new political struggle that would shape the modern world. Cold War had begun. Yet for ordinary civilians, politics often mattered less than survival. Food shortages continued throughout 1945 and beyond, while winters were bitterly cold inside. Damaged buildings without proper heating. Black markets spread across the city as cigarettes, canned goods, and fuel became forms of currency, while families traded heirlooms for bread. Refugees continued arriving from former German territories in the East, increasing overcrowding inside already devastated neighborhoods. Still, life slowly returned. Streetcars began operating again, while schools reopened in damaged buildings and small cafes appeared among the ruins. Musicians performed in partially destroyed theaters, while children born during the war learned to walk beside broken walls blackened by fire. Berlin refused to disappear, but the scars never truly left. Even decades later, pieces of the battle remained visible throughout the city, while bullet marks could still be found on historic buildings and hidden bunkers rested beneath modern streets. The Third Reich had promised eternity. Instead, it ended in smoke, silence, and shattered stone, and from those ruins emerged a divided city, wounded, haunted, but still alive. Berlin had fallen, but its survival would become one of the most powerful stories of the 20th century. Berlin survived, but the scars of 1945 never truly disappeared. Even today, hidden beneath modern streets and restored buildings, traces of the final battle still remain, with bullet marks carved into stone, forgotten bunkers beneath the city, and memories carried by the last generation who witnessed the collapse of the Third Reich with their own eyes. Battle of Berlin was more than the end of a war. It was the violent ending of one of history's darkest regimes, and the beginning of a divided world that would shape the next half-century, and perhaps the most haunting part of all. After the fire, after the destruction, and after the silence, life still returned. Thank you for watching History Ledger. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more deeply researched historical stories told in cinematic detail, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey into history. And if this story moved you, let us know in the comments what moment from Berlin's fall stayed with you the most. Until next time, stay curious and keep history alive.